the first time that Goliath has mentioned anything about David's God. Up to this point, he has just been terrorizing the Israelites. And so David's going to turn this issue inside out. But the real gist of what he's going to do is that he's talking about the armies of the Lord of hosts. And this armies is in plural. There's a spiritual army that's there. And so David's goal in his discourse with Goliath is to bring all of the participants to where they can see that the Lord of Israel, the God of Israel, is alive. He is the living God. And so he's going to do that by killing Goliath. That's where we had left off. So if we pick that back up, David kills Goliath, and I think that it's important that we look at the text here in 1 Samuel 17, because how many times does our text say that he kills Goliath? I'll give you a moment to get open to 1 Samuel 17.
What are we doing here? There we go.
So we'll pick this up in about verse 48. David runs out to the Philistine, and then in 49, David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into the forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. All right, he's dead there, right? But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of his sheath, and killed him. Killed him again. He's killed him twice. Is there a significance into why he killed him twice? He was partially dead. He was mostly dead. He wanted to be sure. Does anyone else have any insight as to why we had to kill him twice? He's dead once, but he's dead again. All right, Bill? Okay. I think that what we're talking about here is that...
I think he said it. Ronnie
the
said
text is
it.
telling us that
Get him to
you
say
can
it
have
again.
something that kills the flesh. The stone killed the flesh. When he chopped his head off, he's killed the soul, he's killed the spirit. So David takes the head. And I believe that when I try to do some support of my statement about why he had to kill him twice, I can find it in Matthew 10:28. And I put a comparative study up here from the NIV and the New King James, because in both of these we're talking about that we don't want to be afraid of something that can just kill our earthly body, but we want to be afraid of something that can kill our soul. And in the NIV, we look at where it says, rather be afraid of the one, that one is capitalized. And in the New King James, but rather fear him, that H is capitalized. So if we really look at what David has done here, he's bringing the Lord God of hosts into view for both armies, both countries, and he's bringing him into view in two ways. Bringing him into view that he has the power not only over the flesh, but over death itself, because Satan has been a type. He's been a representative of what Satan is. And we see David's mastery over, God's mastery over life and death in both body and soul. I think that to continue on, there's a foreshadowing that I see here from Hebrews 2:14, was that through death, this would be Jesus' death, he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. The amazing story here about what God is doing. Let's stop for just a minute and look back at the first part of the chapter of 1 Samuel 17 and look into verse 4 and 5. This is where we're talking about, and even 6. We're talking about here, the text is telling us how big this giant was. And in verse 5, he had a bronze helmet on his head. Now, I've tried to think about, what was this a helmet? Was this a typical hard hat that just had a little brim on it? Or was this a war helmet? And the best that I can find in my studies is that it was a war helmet that probably came down with a nose piece, forehead was fully covered, the cheeks were covered, and only the eyes and the mouth remained uncovered. One of the things that I always try to read into the text is what makes more glory for God. This is a pretty glorious thing in that David has killed a giant, but his aim was at his forehead. His forehead is covered in the helmet. Now, some scholars say that Goliath was so over the top when they sent a boy out that he just took his armor off. No, I don't think so. Others say that when Goliath roared at David, he was so insolent that he just threw his head back and his helmet came off. Would it bring more glory to God for David to have thrown that rock through that bronze helmet? I don't know. But when we study, there's times when it's good to think about what really did happen and how does God reveal himself in a more powerful way. So I just think about how this giant really appeared. We don't know, but he did have a big helmet and he had a bunch of armor on, and he didn't really want to take it off, I don't think, though we do believe that his armor bearer had his shield, so he didn't believe he needed to have the protection of his shield. Well, let's look a little bit more here about what was going on with our scene. David had been sent to the front by his dad to take up some cheese and some figs and some other things to his brothers and to the commander of his brothers. In verse 18, again, I've got a couple of verses here that are for comparison. In the English Standard Version, Jesse tells him, bring some token back from him. And in the NIV, he says, bring back some assurance from them. Now, remember, I've set the scene here where David has killed Goliath and he's chopped his head off. But we've got these other things here in front of us about the armor and about the stone and about the armies and about this request that Jesse had given David. We're not told that David ever took a report back to Jesse. We're not told what he really did. I think that by taking the head, that the head was a token. He's taking the head, and certainly Jesse's going to find out that David has what David has done. As we have taken the life out of Satan, and I said we are the army of God today. We're the army that has moved forward from the time of David to what God has brought us to today. And so we still have the power to do some miraculous things. But in order to do that, we have to call upon God in a way that he's going to be glorified. We have to call upon him in a way that he tells us, I don't have a lot of ways to deny you if you do it in the way I tell you. I don't have to do it when you want me to, but I do have to respond to you. And so I think that as I look at this head, there's some things about it that give me a lot of hope. One of them is Ephesians 1:13 and 14. I think that the head was given to David where does he take the head? Well, we'll get there in just a minute, but he takes this head and he does bring it back in front of Saul before the end of our chapter. But I think that the head shows that that there's a guarantee, there's a deposit. And I link that up to Ephesians, where we're told that you're guaranteed that you have redemption for those who are in God's possession, that praise to His glory. So these are the things that I see that are really what we ought to get out of this story. It's not just about a boy who kills a giant by the power of God. It's about the power of living God, living through eternity and being manifested in all of His children. There are times when all of us are down. There are times when it's impossible to not be afraid. It's impossible to not find something that's going bang in the night, something that is scary. Things like this story are the kinds of things that I ask God to implant in my heart when I'm afraid. That remind me of how He kills giants. The giant of, I'm afraid I won't be successful. I'm afraid that I won't be able to overcome any of the challenges that are put in front of me. The Bible's full of how that is to work. So he doesn't take the head to Jesse. Where does he take the head? Where does he go next in our story with this head? He takes it to Jerusalem. Why does he take it to Jerusalem? Who occupies Jerusalem? The Jebusites do. This is not even, at this point, Jerusalem is not even something that the Israelites possess. So why would he take it there? Well, I think that he takes it there because Jerusalem, he knows that Jerusalem is going to become the holy city. And that Joshua and all the people that followed behind him have not done exactly what God told them to do, which was to take the land. And so he's going to go show these Jebusites who's boss and what's coming. Jerusalem is a hard city to defend. It's built on a hill. And the Jebusites are pretty insulting about how they feel about Jehovah, about Yahweh. So David takes the head and shows it to them. Why does he put the armor in his tent? This is in verse 54. Takes the head to Jerusalem. And the last clause of the verse, but he put his armor in his tent. Is there a significance to why he put the armor in there? Bill.
To the victor belongs the spoils. In that day and time, when you defeated an enemy, whatever belonged to the enemy now belongs to you. And I think that's significant because Satan calls himself the prince of this world. But God wants us to take it over for His glory. So when we move into as Christians, when we move into the world and we bring the message of Christ to other people, and those other people see what God can do for them. We've heard stories here from our missionaries where entire cities or villages and the land around them was possessed by demons or by evil. Sometimes it's evil people, sometimes it's evil demons, and sometimes it's both. And I'm talking about today, not in David's day. And when Christians come in and stand up for the cause of Christ, and they start convicting people there, or the Spirit starts convicting people there of their sin, and they start converting, the land is reclaimed by Christ and by Christians. Just as here David gained the spoils of his victory.
Good. Anyone else have an idea? Comment?
knowing that he was going to, I guess knowing prior to it that he would be king, which was already been foretold. It may not be him, but God setting it up in advance, knowing that it would be, one of those great victories, and that it would be used in the future, I guess, as a symbol to glorify God.
I think so. In keeping with the idea that what I've been trying to do through this series is to look at things that David has that are similarities between Jesus, things that David has done that Holy Spirit, the influence of the Father has done to him to allow him to bear fruits, and then beginning to reflect into the New Testament. Colossians 2:15, having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. He's keeping this armor to show everybody, what God has done, to remind himself. He's got a long ways to go here before he really finds himself. He's got a lot of challenges ahead of him. So I think he kept the armor to keep himself pumped up that this is what God has done.
Sorry. When you said that, it reminded me of Galatians 6:7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he'll also reap. And it continues to, show those people in the future what they'll reap if they come up against God.
Anybody else with anything right here? Okay, one more thing that I see in chapter 17 before we finish it is David's attitude about himself. And we see that in verse 58. David still has a very modest account of himself. Saul brings him in and says, "Whose son are you, young man?" He says, "I'm just the son of your servant Jesse from Bethlehem." If I had just done this, I'd probably be saying, where's all this stuff you promised me? You promised me a princess, you promised me a fortune, and you promised that my dad won't have to pay any more taxes. Where do I get that at? There's a line for this. And I'd probably be doing this, But David is still nowhere near that. He just comes in, he's treating Saul as God's anointed one. I think it's just the exact thing that God tells us, that if you humble yourself before me, you can approach. If you don't think too much of yourself, because we know that no flesh will glory in the presence of the Lord. So, yes.
On the other hand, my first The first step to being able to give those things is to know who the dad is. Because if the father is going to be relieving his taxes, who's the father?
Yes.
If a daughter is being given in marriage, who is your father? Because that has to be set up too. So it's not the wrong question or the wrong answer. It's very logical that those things were asked.
I completely agree. And they had to be brought out. They had to be brought out. And the way that David answers is one of humility. Well, I'm going to turn the page and go to chapter 18. And there's the tone of the story is going to completely change. We had asked earlier how big of a test of faith was Goliath. And really, he wasn't that big of a test. I mean, why? Because David is completely pumped up with the Holy Spirit. And so we're going to turn the page into 18, and life becomes a bit easier for David, less challenging. So, have any of you in here faced serious challenges in life? You know, with health, with finances, with love lost, with all of the things that challenge us. And was that the time when you were as close to God as you've ever been? You didn't have any other choice. I forgot this morning to make my little pitch for continued support of your prayer requests. Continue to put your prayer requests on the prayer list because we're very actively praying for those now. And if you're putting those on there because you're seeking the power of God to intervene, for God to help, to give peace, to give health, to bring closure to issues. And so I think it's easy to see that David was as close to God as he could be when he was going out here to face this giant. And he absolutely had no fear at that point. He's going to have some fear later in his life. And I think that what we see in chapter 18 is that he has a greater challenge here, a test of his faith, than he does when he had to fight Goliath. There's just a lot of things about not having life and death in front of you that make you feel like that you can handle things. When it's so hard that you know you can't handle it, it's easier to draw near to God. So let's look then at the first 5 verses of chapter 18. Now when he finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword, his bow, and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. What do you think that why did David and Jonathan have this relationship? What's surprising to you about it? Is there anything surprising to you about it?
Jonathan should have seen him as a threat to his heir.
He would have certainly have seen him as a threat, because at this point, I'm sure Jonathan thinks he'll be the king someday, or he would like to be.
Jonathan made a unilateral covenant with him.
Jonathan makes this covenant with him. He's decided he's not a threat. One of the things that we see here is that when personal love is demonstrated, that corporate love becomes even more possible. I think if you look at verse 5, there's something here that really insightful. Because of David's behavior, partially he's strengthened by the love and bond of Jonathan. He's behaving wisely. And then in the last clause of verse 5, that he's accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Saul's servants are the same thing as bureaucrats. They're around the court because there's money there, there's food, there's power. So David has been accepted now by all kinds of people, and we see this that when we have these personal relationships that are strong enough to display in a corporate and public way, our influence is magnified. So there's times, and this is hard in today's world when you're around people who are talking about same-sex marriages, they're talking about abortion, they're talking about all kinds of things that that I just don't necessarily feel comfortable just defending it just by walking by and listening to it. But yet I ask God all the time to give me the courage to know how to do that. I was in downtown Fort Worth a couple of weeks ago, and there's a huge rally for Planned Parenthood going on, and there was some people out there in the front of this thing that were lobbying them. They had megaphones and they had placards, and the whole place just had 50 cops all around it. It was just about ready to become a civil war. And I kept thinking to myself, am I supposed to do something? What am I supposed to do? And I looked at myself and said, I guess I just don't love these people enough to know what to do, to struggle hard enough to because what is the greatest form of hatred? Kierkegaard said that it was to not tell somebody about the Lord. So maybe there's some things here that we can gain from trying to love each other more honestly and more openly. It's kind of what I see from that verse. Let's go on into the next breakout here. It's verses 6 through 11. Now it happened as they were coming home. Who's coming home? Well, it's David and Saul. They're coming home. And in verse 7, the women begin to sing about David and Saul. Verse 8, Saul gets real mad about all this. He's mad. He's jealous. Verse 9, he eyes David from that day forward. He doesn't eye him with a good eye. It's not good. And then in verse 10, the next day, God sends a distressing spirit upon Saul. In verse 11, Saul tries to kill David with his spear. What was wrong with the praise that the women sang? Did it elevate David above somebody else? How about God? God is not mentioned in this song. How quickly are we to forget where our power comes from? So the distressing spirit, again, there's so many things in the Bible that, yes, Jackie.
In one version it says an evil spirit from God.
Sure.
It's like that.
Okay. I'm going to go to 1 Kings. It's either 17 or 18. I believe it will be in 18, where Elijah has left the brook Cherith, and he goes to the widow Zarephath. And he's there, and while he's there, the boy, her son, dies. He goes up to the upper room, And in some versions of the Bible, he's going to pray and bring this boy back to life. And in some versions, and that's why I try to do some comparative study, he says, Father, have you allowed evil here? So, I appreciate your comment, Jackie, because where I was just about ready to say about the distressing spirit, it wasn't necessarily to compare the distressing to the evil, but it was to bring out the point. There's not anything. God is over all. He's over all the spirits. He's over the good ones and the bad ones. And none of them get out without God letting them out. Or, if we refuse to bend our knee, we enable them. And so, you see, I don't know if I've explained the difference between an evil spirit and a distressing spirit, but they're about the same. Go ahead.
I liken this to God and Satan and Job. God had to allow that to happen.
Yes.
He didn't even, I'm trying to remember correctly, I'm trying to quote it correctly, is he didn't order the devil anywhere and said, I rebuke you. When God rebuked the devil, he didn't want to cast him out and force him, but he allowed Satan to do what he did to Job, but he said, do not kill him. So I think it was something that God allowed. I don't think God sends the evil upon anyone, but it's something he allowed Satan to take part in.
So if we said that differently, what you could say is that an evil spirit asked to go to trouble Saul, and God said, yeah, go ahead.
Also, when King Ahab, and I think was it Ahab and Jezebel?
Yes.
It said one day God was in heaven and he said, who can I send to talk to him? And it says a lying spirit came forth and God sent a lying spirit. So I do believe he was totally in charge.
Bill.
Since God has already shown us in previous parts of the Old Testament that he's in charge regardless what the circumstances are. But if you think about human nature and realize that Saul is already under condemnation by Samuel. He's already been, the kingship has already been taken away from him, even though he's going to remain king, but his progeny will never inherit. Okay, he knows this psychologically, all right? Now, all God has to do to bring a distressing spirit upon Saul is to remove from Saul's mind all the beauty and wonder and grace that he has brought upon Saul in previous years and made Saul king. He just removes that from Saul's mind. Saul is going to become paranoid. That is human nature. He's going to start looking at everything around him as negative. It doesn't matter who's singing what. If he can't hear the words, then obviously they're not singing about me, they're singing praises to David. You can see this in your fellow workers and your school children and everything else. That is human nature. So God didn't have to actually put any kind of evil in him. All he had to do was remove the good from Saul's mind that he'd previously given him. Then Saul's mind took over from there, and everything became negative after that, because that's our nature when we don't have God.
It's who we are. Okay, Robert.
The context reveals that Saul opened his heart by having envy because of the songs sung by the women that came from so many cities and giving so much recognition to David. And so Saul totally opened up his heart to that by his envy, his jealousy, etc. I mean, it's right there in the text. And God just allowed it to go further. And so that warns us.
It warns us, but does David allow this praise to go to his head? No. But look at Luke 6:26. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. David doesn't let it go to his head. Does he ever? Is there a time in David's life when the praise of men is more important?
God had a 40-year working in the making kingdom.
I'm sorry to hear you.
God had a 40-year working in the making kingdom.
Yes. There's a time when the praise of men is important to David. We're not going to get there. It's about 30 more lessons away. It's called Bathsheba. And I think he sent the distressing spirit to just show that Saul had a lack of love. Saul's ability to love. The more, this book is harder than differential equations and linear algebra. It's harder than chemistry and biology because it's just absolutely a story that has more and more and more in it. And so the more that I have studied it, the more I've learned that I don't have enough love. That Saul had, his love meter was pointed down. David's is pointed up. And Saul is so bad that he's willing to even attempt murder. We see in verses 12 through 16 that David is demoted from Saul's bodyguard to a captain in the army. Why would Saul do this? He's mad at him. He doesn't like him. He's jealous of him. He's fearful of him. But what is Saul's expected outcome of this?
Death and battle.
He hopes he gets killed in battle. Well, why is Saul so afraid of David? He's afraid because of the popularity that David has with God. The people bother him, but he also knows that David is way advanced in spiritual matters. Well, yes, Jay.
It goes back to Goliath's challenge. Why didn't if Saul knew God was with him, and why didn't he accept the challenge against Goliath? I mean, he was like everyone else. If God was with him and God was in favor of him, he could do it. He could have killed Goliath easily. But I think it's his lack of faith that kept him, and it compounded even more. That's my opinion. Compounded even more after God worked through David to kill Goliath, or God assisted David to kill Goliath.
Certainly Saul knows that God didn't fill him with the courage to go kill Goliath. Yes. Yes. The comment was that Saul is using a tactic that David learns, and he does it when he uses it to kill Uriah. Kind of turning the corner here to finish up the chapter, and if I can, I've got a couple of at least one good clunker at the end that will, I think is pretty strong. In verse 17, is Saul trying to fulfill his promises? Let's look at this. Then Saul said to David, here's my older daughter, Nrh, or Arab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him, which is to your point, King. So he's going to give him this, Nrh. But then he doesn't. He takes her back. In verse 19, he gives her to Adriel, the Meholathite, as a wife. Why does he do that? Why does he decide not to give the first girl? It isn't because that David isn't going to go be, hadn't followed orders to go be valiant and fight these battles. This is one that without the power of the computer, I could never be able to catch this. But it's, if you have the time and you take all of these different people's names and you plug them into a database like Bible Hub, or there's others, I use that Bible Hub, you find out that Adriel comes back to view in 2 Samuel 21. Now, that is where the Gibeonites are, there's a drought in the land. And David inquires to the Lord, why is there a drought? And the Lord tells him it's because that you, as a nation, have not kept the covenant that you made with these Gibeonites back in Joshua 9. And the only way that they're going to get this drought to end is to go to these guys and ask them what they want. And so what they want are some of Saul's kinfolk, specifically his sons. He doesn't have enough sons left, but they want 7 of them. So David agrees to give them the grandsons. She has 5 boys. The Gibeonites hang all of them. I see God's hand at work there too. If he had married her, and that would have come about, David would have lost all of his sons in one stroke. Eventually loses most of them. But there's God's hand at work. Why did Saul want to give Michal, Kel, whatever her name is, to David? I'm sorry, did someone answer? She loved him. She did love him. But is she good for him? Saul knows, and he says here, that she may be a snare to him. What kind of a snare is she going to be? When David brings the ark back in 2 Samuel, and he's dancing wildly in front of the ark, she finds great disfavor with him. And she has never spiritually supported him. And in 2 Samuel 6:23, she is barren of children. She never has any children. And so she was not good for him, and Saul recognized that. He's trying as hard as he can to disrupt David. And these are the kinds of tests that are easy to fall trap to when you are not faced with a giant. David does not necessarily feel faced with a giant, I don't think, in chapter 18, though he remains extremely faithful. He does not fall away, as we might sometimes after we've won a great victory over a health issue or a love lost or a financial type thing. We sometimes let our guards down. He's still got his guard up. He has not let anything stop him from following the Lord. There's a couple of things about David that I wanted to say as I come to a close. David wanted to build the temple. Why won't God let him build the temple? Say it again. He's a man of war. What does God tell him about it? That you've got blood on your hands. He tells him in 1 Chronicles 22:8, you can't build this thing because you've got blood on your hands. You've killed too many people. One of the things from this text that I take here in 18:25, then Saul said thus, to tell David this, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemy. But Saul thought to make David fall before the hand of the Philistines. So David goes out and he doubles it. He antes it up. He brings back 200. Is it a fault of David that he's a man of war? No. But did he like it more than he should have? I think maybe he did. But then when you look in 1 Kings 15:5, God says that he really has no problem with David other than the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So we know that the biggest problem that David ever had was not necessarily, a bloodlust of killing. It was not necessarily what he did with Bathsheba. It was the murder. Because we know that God tells us that the lake of fire and brimstone will be full of liars and murderers. Time might be for one. What was the real sin of Bathsheba? Did someone have a comment?
Idleness.
Yes, Paul.
Idleness.
Idleness, that's certainly one of them.
Death of her husband.
Okay? He killed her husband.
Wanted something he couldn't have, or something that wasn't his.
He had covetousness. These are all the outward displays of what I think was really wrong. Yes, Bill.
It says that David was back at the palace when his army was out fighting the war. Okay, in those days, the leaders of the armies went out with their armies to fight the war. And David had always done that prior to this. But he got lazy and decided that he was king, he didn't have to go back out. So he just sent the army to do the work that he was supposed to be out there leading them in. And when he sat back in ease and luxury in his palace, when his army was out there fighting, he saw Bathsheba, and then the sin began. And it didn't begin just because she was beautiful. It began because he wasn't out there doing the job that he was supposed to be doing.
I was just thinking, though, David, with Bathsheba, David had gone out onto his terrace or whatever, and he looked down and saw Bathsheba. In that moment, he was tempted. But I think the big sin was not that he was tempted. We can all be tempted.
Yes.
He continued to look.
Yes, he did. My time is up. Let me read to you from 2 Samuel 12:8. This is God speaking back to David. And he says, I gave you your master's house, your master's wives into your keeping, and I gave you into the house of Israel and Judah. And if that hadn't been too little, I would have given you much more. David's real sin is he's just not happy with what God gave him. And it led to all of those other things. And how often do I fail to acknowledge God in all my ways? Because he has given me everything I need to be happy. Just like he gave David. And I think that the real lesson here is to understand that God has given us not only the bread for today, not only the things that you have, but what is the gift of salvation really worth? And if you just take that, is that not enough? If it isn't, just ask me, and I will give you so much more. Thank you very much.